Hello and welcome to another episode of Team Blush. Today we are going to be repairing the 240SX power steering pump with this power steering pump kit that you can get on Rock Auto for about $15. And that is a lot cheaper than buying a remanufactured pump, which would cost around $130. As you can see underneath the car, there's a small leak, and I've traced this back to the power steering pump. So let's go ahead, get the hood open, get the power steering pump out onto the table, and let's get this rebuilt. A little out of context for the video, but if you have a car that is low to the ground at all and it is a pain to jack up and you have to put wood blocks underneath your jack to even get it high enough to put a jack stand under, build some of these ramps. They're super easy to build, and I will leave a link down in the description of the video where you can see an article on how to actually build these. It's pretty easy, but it definitely makes your life so much easier. I definitely recommend it. I will not be fully jacking the car up on jack stands and stuff for this because I think it'll be too hard to get to the power steering pump if the front end is jacked all the way up in the air. All I did was get the boards underneath the wheels so that I could slip my oil pan underneath to catch any of that power steering fluid, because I assume that this is about to get really messy. So let's go ahead, get the hood open, and see what bolts we need to undo to get this power steering pump out of the car. Giving this a quick look, I believe the best plan of attack is going to be to get this intake off, get this upper fan shroud off, and then we can look into getting the belt tension undone, pull the belt off, and then start getting into the meat of taking off the power steering pump. So first off, let's get this intake off. I have taken this off before. It is just this little hose clamp right here, these two lines, this screw right here, this screw right here, and this hose clamp right here. And then this whole piece should come up and out. So let's go ahead and take the intake off, and then I will show you how to take the upper fan shroud off. Getting the intake off has given me a look at the top side of this fan shroud, and after having pulled the belts on another occasion, I now remember how much of a pain this fan shroud would be to take off. So instead, what I'm going to do is take off this last little bit of the intake, which is just this hose clamp right here and this hose clamp here. Just going to take that off and see if can't take off the power steering pump through this area right here. So get that off, and then we will go about undoing the tension on the belt. To release the tension from this belt right here, all you gotta do is come to the right here until you find this tensioner pulley and undo this bolt right here. And as you undo it, you will slowly relieve tension on the belt until it slides off, and then you have to maneuver it around the fan so you can take it off fully. And as a side note, this would be a great time to get this belt replaced if it's fraying or if it's old. They're cheap enough, might as well do it while you have it off. So not only is it this bolt right here that I said to undo, but it is also this nut on the front of the pulley right here. Just undo that, and then the belt will lose tension, just like this. You just have to push it inward, and then with that you can take the belt off of the pulleys itself, and then you should be able to slowly maneuver it around the fan and off the car, just like that. So now moving on to getting the actual power steering pump out of the car, I've been looking at it for just a little bit now, and I think that I will only have to undo about 7 bolts to get it out of the car. I will show you those bolts right now, and if there are any others that you need to take out, I will let you know in just a moment. But at the moment, I believe that this bolt right back here under this wire, that's one of them. The second one is obviously this bolt right here that connects this line. There are 2 bolts on either side of this line right here that I believe need to come off. And then there are 3 that are actually hidden behind this pulley right here. So if we take a look on the back side, we can see one right here, and then there is another right here, and then hidden underneath the bottom of this pulley, it's really hard to get this angle, but there's another bolt right there. So to get to these, you actually have to rotate this pulley so that the hole corresponds with each bolt that you have to get to, and undo them in that manner. So once I am done pulling those bolts, we'll see if there are any others that are hidden from my view, but I think that will be about it, and then we will be able to pull the power steering pump out of the car. Well, would you look at that? It was indeed the 7 bolts that I thought it would be. And actually, ideally, if you didn't want to take off the 2 bolts for the little bracket, I guess, that goes to this line, you could just take off this little hose clamp. But whatever, it's already off, and so I'll show you. Took those 7 bolts off, and it's just as easy as pulling it out of here. Make sure that you have an oil pan down below because this does get messy as you're taking it apart. So that's the pump out of the car, and I'm gonna go actually take a look and see how much was actually leaking in the car before coming back over to the table to show you how to rebuild it. Sorry for the fan noise, but it is pretty warm in the garage right now, so I gotta stay cool. Some might question why I am actually doing a power steering pump rebuild, because I mean that doesn't make power. That's not an exciting thing to do to a 240. But as you can see from all of this nastiness down in the engine bay, when I bought this car, the alternator had actually died, and it was a huge pain to get back home because of that. And looking at it now, I believe this is because the power steering pump was leaking. So as preventative maintenance to keep an alternator alive, it is a good idea to make sure that things above it are not leaking down onto it. This is a lot. I mean, I don't know how long this power steering pump has been leaking for, but it's such a simple process, it makes you wonder why skip this. But thankfully now the car has a new owner, so let's go ahead, go over to the bench and get this power steering pump rebuilt. I will be cleaning up a lot of this mess off camera so that it looks a lot better when we install the power steering pump after we rebuild it. Just one more quick aside before we head over to the bench. Got all this decently cleaned up. It's not amazing, but I plan to have this engine out of the car in the future, so we can clean it better then. A tip for cleaning engine bays is oven cleaner. Yes, who would have thought? Removes grease from ovens, so does well in removing grease from engine bays. Use oven cleaner and a toothbrush to get into the very tight areas, and it can get looking pretty clean. So a lot better than spending some pretty steep cash on some automotive products that do the exact same thing. So that's my tip. Let's head over to the bench and get this power steering pump rebuilt finally. Now that we have gotten the power steering pump off of the car, we are going to actually clean it just a little bit more with some of that oven cleaner that I just talked about in the last clip of the video. We want this to be as spick and span as possible before we go pulling it apart and actually rebuilding the pretty sensitive internals of the power steering pump. So just get a toothbrush. Try not to spray any of the oven cleaner inside of the holes where your hose is attached to, and get this thing as clean as you can. Now that the power steering pump is as clean as I really want to get it, we can go ahead and start attempting to get this pulley nut off of here. Now, I hear that this is a bit of a pain. A lot of people suggest that you should do this while it is on the car. So we are going to learn right now whether or not that is some advice that I should have heeded before completely pulling it out of the car. Well, it does look like that I should have heeded that advice indeed. So what I've done is I have put the bolt for the bracket back into the pulley just enough so that it doesn't spin completely. What I'm going to do is get a long breaker bar, set this on the ground, and put my foot on it so that I can get some leverage without this trying to rotate while I take that nut off. Putting the pump on the ground and trying to get that pulley nut off did not work. It just spins underneath your foot while you're trying to do it. So all I've done is temporarily just threaded this bolt back down into the bracket to hold on to the power steering pump, and now while it's in the car I will get that nut off. So if you're doing this yourself, make sure to get that pulley nut off prior to pulling it out of the car. Holy crap, that nut on the end of the pulley is no joke. I could not get the pulley to stop spinning, so I ended up just getting a screwdriver and jamming it in between the holes on the pulleys so that I got enough leverage to pull down on the ratchet. I had to use this monster of a pry bar. It's just a huge pipe to actually get that loosened. So definitely make sure keep that in the car when you are undoing it, and hopefully you have a pry bar or a pipe or something laying around to help you with that, because it's brutal. Now that we have that pulley nut off, we can bring it back over to the table to finish disassembly so that we can get to rebuilding it. Well, that was fun. So go ahead and get this pulley nut off of here. And with the pulley nut, there is an associated crush washer. And now that we have the pulley off, we can flip it around and start undoing these two bolts right here to get this bracket off. Well, yet again, it seems like these two bolts were torqued down by the Hulk himself. So what I ended up doing is using this bracket right here to actually hold on to the power steering pump for me. I just ran the bolt through the bracket right there just to hold on to it in this position so that I could get my socket and wrenches onto these bolts and undo them. And as you can see, it was pretty rough on them. I didn't strip them, but they were getting pretty close to rounding off, so just be wary of that. And I definitely envy you if you have an impact or a vise to hold on to this while you are doing this job. So let's head back over to the table once again and hope that these next 4 bolts are not as torqued down as the rest have been. Just finish getting these 2 bolts out of the bracket. Set that aside. And then now we have access to our 4 bolts that will actually give us access to the inside of the power steering pump. Well, it seems like it is indeed going to be the same old story on these 4 bolts, so I'm going to head back over to the car and mount the power steering pump so that I can get the leverage on those bolts and get them out. Well, I guess that was a stupid idea. As you can see right here, I ended up snapping the housing where the power steering pump mounts to the bracket in the car. I was holding the power steering pump with that bracket, and I had a bolt through this hole, and I was just giving it too much. It would have been smarter to actually thread in all 3 bolts and go with those 4 bolts that I've been trying to untighten, but made a mistake. I'm making that mistake so that you don't make that mistake. So if you're doing this without a vise or without impact tools, don't try and untorque those 4 bolts while holding it on just one of these mounting points. If you are going to do this, which I'm not sure if I really suggest you to do, make sure that you're holding it on all 3 points right here so that the load is distributed while you are untightening these 4 bolts. Now I'm going to try and hopefully not break these other 2 mounts. I'm going to thread them in to hold the power steering pump while I try and get off 3 more of these. I was able to untighten one of them, but the second one that I tried to untighten did end up in that break right there. So I will update here in a little bit on whether or not I completely destroy more of this power steering pump or if I am successful in getting these last 3 bolts out. See you in a bit. After our little mishap there, we have finally gotten the 4 bolts loosened enough so that we can finally start taking this power steering pump apart. I would definitely recommend that if you were going to do this job yourself to have either a vise or an impact gun, because that was just way too hard. It really was not worth it in the end for how long it took me to actually undo these 4 bolts and those 2 bracket bolts earlier. Yeah, so just definitely have a vise, have an impact gun, have proper tools so that you don't run into breaking the housing like I ended up having to do. So undo these 4 bolts completely. And another little tip is to put some thread lubricant on these bolts before pulling them out. I ended up doing that prior to undoing them. You can see on the back side here, there's a little area where you can spray some deep creep, some penetrant, whatever you got. So now that we have these 4 bolts undone and out of the way, we can pull the pump apart. And when doing this, this is the point where you want to be as clean as possible, have your little work area free of as much debris as you can. It's kind of hard to keep it really clean, but just keep it in mind. At this point, once you have taken the power steering pump apart, it should be in 2 pieces. And don't worry if this side of the pump actually fell apart, because I will show you actually how it fits together. This is all one body, so you don't have to worry about that. But this inner mechanism right here just sits down in this little cavity, and the face that has the S symbol faces out. If any of these little vanes pop out when you are separating the power steering pump, you can put them back in, and when you do, just make sure that the rounded edge of the vane is facing out, and then this fits right on top of that, and it is actually keyed so that you can only put it on one way. Now, this side of the pump, we do not actually have to worry about. There are no seals and there is nothing to rebuild on this side of the pump, so that is good to go. The only thing that you may want to do is go on the edge of this face right here and maybe clean it up if it's a little bit dirty, so that when we put on our new gasket material, that it seats properly. Now we can get a look at the main part of our power steering pump that we will be rebuilding. And at this point, it will probably be a good idea to get your power steering pump rebuild kit, open it up, and start getting an idea of what gaskets, O-rings, and seals we are going to be replacing on this pump. So it looks like it comes with a little guide on how to do this yourself, which is nice. And then we have our seal, some O-rings, our main gasket, some washers, and a crush washer. And it looks like that is about it. So let's go ahead and finish disassembling this part of the pump. There is just this gasket that we can go ahead and take off. And we will just set that aside into a little pile that we will keep in mind is our old O-ring and gasket pile, so that we don't reuse it. There is a spring on the inside of the housing that you can pull right out. Set that aside. If you get a pick or a very fine screwdriver, you can get in here and pull out this O-ring on the outer edge of this housing, and be careful when you are pulling this out so that you don't mar or damage this housing. And we can see that this correlates with one of the O-rings that we were given in our kit. So put that aside. It looks like that there is another O-ring right around the shaft at the bottom here. So we can go ahead and take that out with, again, a pick or a screwdriver, and correlate it with one of our O-rings from our kit, and it looks like that one right there will do it. Now if we flip the pump around, we can see on the back side here that there is a C-clip. So go ahead and get this off. Now that we have removed that C-clip, we can go ahead and hit the shaft of the power steering pump out. Make sure that when you are hitting it, that you are hitting it from the inside of the pump outward, so that it comes out in this direction. With that out, you can see the main shaft and the bearing right here. And while you're in here, give this a spin. If it feels crunchy or if it's making some noise, you may want to go ahead and replace that bearing. Luckily, mine seems to be pretty good, so I am not going to be replacing that at this time. With the shaft of the power steering pump removed, this is pretty much as bare as it will get. There is one last seal inside of the area where the shaft sits. So with a pick or screwdriver or whatever your tool is, go ahead and fish that out of there. Alright, after a little bit of cleaning up, things were starting to get messy. My phone was starting to overheat from filming because it is just so hot out here. We are ready to rebuild this power steering pump. So first off, let's go ahead and put this new seal in, the one that we just took out in the last step. And I have a little bit of ATF in this cap right here that I am just going to dip my finger into and use to lubricate that seal around the edges as I put it in, just to give it a little bit of lubrication as I seat it down into the power steering pump. Make sure when inserting this new seal that the side with the interior spring visible sits down. Go ahead and seat that inside of the housing. And as you can see, it is now seated flush with that edge. And it helped for me to get a socket the same diameter as that seal and hit it down with a hammer just so that it sits flush. Next up, we can go ahead and reinsert the shaft of the power steering pump back into the housing. So to do this, we have the longer side goes down first into the area where we just put our seal. And now we can go ahead and seat this with a preferably rubber hammer, but if you do not have a rubber hammer, you can use a piece of cloth or something soft to just put over the top right here as you hammer it down and seat it back into place. And it really doesn't take much force to seat that shaft back down into the power steering pump body. The bearing sits just below a ridged edge on the interior of this diameter, and that ridged edge is where we will clip our new C-clip into. Alright, so now we can go ahead and take our needle nose pliers or a C-clip tool and compress this C-clip and seat it underneath the ridge that the bearing sits under. Alright, now we've gotten that C-clip installed, and we can go ahead and move to the interior of the power steering pump body. So at this point, we need to put the O-ring back onto the base of the shaft in the power steering pump body. So if we go over to the O-rings that were used previously, again, we can match this up with the O-rings from our new kit and see that this is the O-ring that we need. Just slip that down over the shaft of the power steering pump like that. We have another O-ring, the largest O-ring in the kit, that again just sits loosely down on the bottom edge of the power steering pump housing. So just lubricated that with a little bit of ATF and seat it down in there just like that. And with those two interior O-rings installed, we can go ahead and turn the power steering pump so that we get access to this O-ring right here. We just need to fish this out with a pick or flathead screwdriver or whatever you have. Right, there we go. I got that out with a very tiny flathead screwdriver. And as you can see, that is incredibly flat. I believe that this is actually where most of the leaking for the power steering pump was occurring. But while I was in here, might as well replace all of the O-rings as well. So match that up to a much better looking O-ring, but I'm going to actually do that whenever I put it on the car because it is just going to keep falling out as I finish rebuilding this power steering pump. And with that, we can go ahead and put our gasket onto the housing of the power steering pump with the gasket just put on here and held together with my fingers. I'm going to go ahead and put the spring back into the power steering pump, and at this point this is when it would be a good idea to inspect and make sure that there is no debris or nastiness inside of this power steering pump housing before we go and mate it back together with its other half. I find it easiest to just put your finger down in here to line up the splines of the pump mechanism with the shaft, and then seat it together while it's sideways. And just like that, they should seat together pretty well so that you can then go ahead and start running your bolts down through these 4 holes. And with that, you should be pretty well done with assembling the power steering pump back together. Just have to torque these down. I'm not sure if there's a torque rating. I'm going to torque them down to a decent bit. I'm not going to torque them down like the previous Hulk did, but I will snug them down to where it is not going to come loose as I am driving down the road. And when you are tightening this down, do it in a crisscross pattern. That's just kind of standard with most things that you do in automotive when you are torquing stuff down. Just make sure that when you are torquing it down that it is getting torqued down evenly across each side. And once those 4 bolts are torqued down, you've pretty much rebuilt the pump. Now we can go ahead and reinstall our little bracket that allows us to mount it to the engine. And I believe this came off. Yes, just like this. So your longer bolt sits in this larger hole. And then you have an associated tiny bolt that sits down in this smaller hole. So those are now installed. You can go ahead and put the pulley back onto the shaft here. So the way that the pulley is put back on is obviously the same way it came off, but if you weren't paying attention to that, these spokes on the pulley should be facing downward as you put it back onto the splines. And in our kit, we got a new crush washer that goes on next. And after that, we will thread back on the nut to keep the pulley onto the shaft. I apologize for the sudden cut in the video, but the pulley is now on the power steering pump, and we can tighten it down the rest of the way once it's on the car, because once you try and torque it down, it just spins in your hand. So again, with having to deal with this pulley on the car, that is the best scenario if you do not have a vise. So with that, we have the entire pump ready to go on the car, so we will head back over there and do everything just the opposite of what we did when taking it off. So I will meet you over there in just a second. Alright, we have gotten the power steering pump put back into the car, but we do not have anything tightened down yet. So first off, going to get the bolt and tighten down this little bracket here. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the bolt that goes through here. And remember, that has to be inserted through the power steering pump pulley itself, through these holes. And then there will be another down on this side. It's hard to see, but it will go right here. It's another bolt that will have to go through the hole of the pulley. And unfortunately, there would be a third, but that is the one that I ended up breaking earlier in the video. So I will only have 3 points of mounting for the power steering pump now, but I believe that will be sufficient enough to hold on to the power steering pump for the future. We have successfully gotten the bolts installed. That bolt there, this bolt right here, and then that bolt right down there. So next I'm going to go ahead and torque down the pulley nut as far as I can. I'm sure there's a torque spec for that, and I will look it up when I get inside to edit this video, and I will put it on the screen right here somewhere in the video. But next I'm going to go ahead and install this power steering line after doing the pulley nut. The pulley nut has now been torqued down quite a bit. So now, instead of doing this line right here, which I'm going to use for something at the very end before putting this all back together, I am going to go ahead and reinstall this line onto this area of the power steering pump. So while doing this, this is where that O-ring goes. It's going to be kind of interesting to put back together, but we need to seat this O-ring, put this back on to the power steering pump, and then while doing that, we have to get this little bracket, which sits just like this on the power steering pump. We need to thread the larger bolt through this bracket onto the power steering pump, just like that. And there is a smaller bolt that goes onto the bottom side of this bracket right here. So it's going to be a little puzzle to try and get this all together at the exact same time, but we will get it done. This line has been reattached, and we have also put this bracket back on while reattaching that. So the method that I used when putting this back on was to put the O-ring on and then thread in this lower bolt as you push this hose on, and then that will allow you to snug this hose down just enough so that it's a lot easier to put this little bracket on and thread this bolt in to tighten it down. And when you're putting this bracket in, make sure that this little indentation is on the left side, because this little notch in this hose is what's going to sit down in this as you thread this back in. Before I go installing this line into the top of the power steering pump, I'm going to try and feed a little bit of ATF down into this hole, or power steering fluid if that's what you're going to be using. I am going to do that to attempt to prime the pump as much as I can before putting the belt back on and actually running the pump at full speed. So I used a turkey baster to just feed in some ATF until it stopped leaking down further into the pump. Not sure if that really did anything or not. I hand cranked the pulley and it doesn't seem to be going down in there any further, so we'll see. Next up, we need to install our new washers that came with the kit. So one will go right on top of this ring right here, and then the other one will fit onto this bolt as you seat it down. Just for visual representation of that, here is one of the new washers. The second one I will be just putting onto the bolt right there. You will put the bolt through the line, and then the line will fit down into that hole. And then you just thread it down onto it. We will torque that down. I will probably try and hand crank the pulley some more, again, just to keep on priming that pump. Fill the power steering pump reservoir. Then we can go ahead and get the belt back onto the pulleys so that we can give it a test. The line has been torqued down, And again, I'm sure that this bolt has a torque spec, and if I find that, I will put that in the video right now. But next, let's go to getting this belt put back onto the pulleys. To do this, we'll have to go underneath the car and fish this line around the fan, just like we did whenever we were taking it off. And the line will go around this pulley, and then there's a pulley that you can see right there. It's your crank pulley. That is the other one that it will go around. And underneath the description of the video, I will put a link to a picture of the belt diagram for the 240SX. It's pretty self-explanatory, but if you have any questions, you can always just throw a question down in the comments. I'm usually watching the videos for a while after I upload them. So let's go ahead and get this belt put back on, and then I will show you how to tension it once again with the tensioner pulley right here. Didn't need to actually go under the car to feed the belt over the pulleys. Just had to feed the belt down behind the fan and then onto the crank pulley, which is down there. To put tension on this belt, all you have to do is come to the right of the power steering pump pulley to the idler pulley right here and pull this as far as you can to the right until the belt has tension. Then once it's at this point, just go ahead and tighten this bolt down as far as it will go. And once it gets to that point, it should be tightened. And I forgot to mention that tighten this bolt down about as far as it will go, but don't over tighten it because that is actually pulling this belt even tighter. So pull it until this belt is just decently tight, but not overly tight. And then once you've gotten it to that point, go ahead and lock down the pulley by tightening this nut on the pulley itself. And with that, we have successfully pulled the power steering pump off the car, rebuilt it, and put it back in. So let's go ahead and put our intake back on the car before we fill up the power steering pump reservoir, and then we can go ahead and test it on the car to make sure it is properly working. To put the intake back on the car, you will first put on this piece right here, and this hose will fit onto the breather on top of the valve cover. Then you'll just need to move this hose clamp onto there. This hose clamp will need to be tightened right here, as well as this one right here. There are two hoses that you took off while taking the intake off. You have this larger one right here and this smaller one. This bolt right here, this bolt right here, and then one final hose clamp right here. The intake has been reinstalled onto the car completely, and I have gone and overfilled the power steering pump reservoir with my ATF. So without further ado, I'm going to get in the car and turn the wheels from side to side, left and right, twice, without the car on, so that I can again prime the pump even more before we cross our fingers and turn the car on to see if the pump, for one, even functions anymore. I've never done this myself, so we will see if I have destroyed the pump or if it still works. And if it still works, we'll see if it is no longer leaking. So let's go ahead and I will take you on that stressful journey. And And after all that, that is actually really exciting. I was pretty doubtful that the pump would actually still work, again, because I've never done that before. But I did not see any leaks when I was peeking into the engine bay just then. Time will tell. I'm definitely going to take it down off the blocks, take it for a drive and whatnot, and then I will get back to you at the very end of this video with a thanks for watching, all that stuff, and let you know how everything went. Well, I took the car for a little test drive around the block, and looking underneath the car, it doesn't look like there are any more leaks from the power steering pump. So I will call that a win. We will see in the future if it is actually leaking a tiny amount and is just not noticeable at the moment. But I am just happy that the power steering pump actually ended up working out and I didn't destroy it. Like I said, this is my first time I've ever rebuilt a power steering pump, so I am somewhat impressed. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks a bunch. Like I always say, for watching the entire thing. It always helps when everyone watches to the end of these videos and likes, comments, subscribes, all that fun stuff. It really does help. I know everyone says it helps. It truly does. Follow us over on Instagram at team.blush. I will put it up on the screen right now for you to see. Hit us up there. Show us some of your builds. I'm always curious to see what the community is doing with their own cars, and it helps with inspiration for where this is going to go. So until next time, take it easy, and we'll see you on another episode of Team Blush.